Okay, today we are going to go over our third tab of the foldable. It's called Trinomials. We'll be doing 4 examples. We'll start out with the basic ones and get into a little bit more complicated ones. But it's important to understand you need to know how to factor by grouping and do the greatest common factor to factor trinomials. Okay, here's our first example of factoring trinomials. Notice how the trinomials we're factoring, or at least this one, is a quadratic equation. What we're going to create is we're going to create something called a t-chart. And if you remember back from quadratic equations, you have an a, b, and a c. A is the number in front of x squared. B is the number in front of x. C is the number usually at the end. It's a number by itself. So what I'm going to go ahead and write up here, just copy down and I'll explain it. Okay, so what I'm making is a t-chart. So I'm going to put t-chart. Okay, so you know what it is. And I'm going to go ahead and write something here. I'm writing a times c, and then I'm abbreviating multiply. And then I'm writing a b over here, and I'm going to write add underneath. Okay, so here's basically what I'm doing. I'm going to try to solve a number riddle, and whatever the riddle solves as, it's going to help me factor the problem really easily. I can only do this with quadratic equations where a is 1. In other words, there's not a number in front of x squared. Okay, but I'll still use a t-chart on factoring every trinomial problem. So right now, my a times c in this problem, a is 1, c is 24. So a times c should be 24, which I'll write there. And then your b is negative 11. Okay, so I'm going to put it here. So here's the number riddle. I need to figure out 2 numbers that multiply that give me 24, and the same 2 numbers have to add to give me a negative 11. So you may need to think about it a little bit. Here's what I know. In order to multiply 2 numbers and get positive 24, both numbers either have to be positive or both have to be negative. Okay, so I know that. In order for the numbers to add and get a negative answer, what that tells me is I originally had to multiply 2 negative numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and stick 2 negatives there. Okay, 2 negative numbers that multiply to give me 24 and add up to get negative 11 would be negative 8 and negative 3. Okay, so here's what I know then. If I know what multiplies to give me 24 and adds to negative 11, here's what this will factor out to. I'm simply going to write x's there, and I know one of them will be x minus 8 and the other x minus 3. So I'm simply putting in the negative 8 and the negative 3 in the parentheses. Let me show you real quick why that actually works. Okay, if I multiply this out and distribute, okay, I'm foiling. I get x squared. X times negative 3 is negative 3x. Negative 8 times x is negative 8x. And negative 8 times negative 3 is positive 24. When you combine like terms which are in the middle, you can see you actually get negative 11x's in the middle, okay, plus 24 at the end. So this problem ends up equaling the problem you started with. Okay? What I've essentially done is I've changed this problem right here that had addition and subtraction. I changed it into this answer, which was multiplication. That's the whole point of factoring. Taking something and changing it into multiplication. Every factoring problem does it. Okay, I went ahead and wrote our second example up here, and we're going to go ahead and use a factor tree again. Notice how it is a trinomial. Okay, notice how I can't take anything out of all 3 terms. Okay, otherwise I would try to do that first. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is start with my t-chart, just like I made before. So let me fill this out real quick. Okay, so just like the last problem, my first part of the t-chart, first numbers I'm trying to multiply are whatever a times c equals. A in this case is 1 again, c is negative 36. So when you multiply a and c, you get negative 36. And it's going to add to give you b. B in this case is negative 5, the number in front of x. So what I need to figure out is what multiplies to give me negative 36 and what adds to give me negative 5. First thing I know, in order to multiply and get a negative number, I know one number has to be positive and the other negative. Okay? So if I think of a combination that I can multiply a positive and negative number and get negative 36 and add to negative 5, I can solve the problem right away. That combination in this case is negative 9 and positive 4. Okay, 4 times negative 9 is negative 36. 4 plus negative 9 is negative 5. So that means this problem would factor out to x plus 4, x minus 9. Just simply filling in the positive 4, negative 9. And you can multiply it out like I did on the last problem and see that it would give you originally what you started with. Okay, now we're going to get into problems that are a little bit more complicated. These are trinomials that have a number in front of x squared. I'm still going to make a t-chart, but the numbers I get from my t-chart that fit the number riddle aren't exactly going to solve the problem right away, but I still need to use them. So let me start off by making my t-chart. Okay, so I made it. In this problem, my a times c, a is 5, c is 2, so a times c is 10. Okay, and b ends up being 11, the number in front of x. So I'm trying to figure out two numbers that multiply to give me positive 10 and add to give me 11, positive 11. You'll figure out the numbers end up being 1 and 10. Okay, 1 and 10. So I am going to use those, but I'm not going to use those to get my answers right away. Here's what we're going to do. Since you have a number in front of x squared, okay, what you're going to have to use is you're going to have to use grouping to solve the problem and factor it. Unfortunately, in order to use grouping, you need an even amount of numbers so you can pair them up. Right now you can see I only have 3 things, 3 terms. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to keep the first term the same. You're going to keep the last term the same. The middle term you're going to split up into 2 terms that equal the same thing. Okay, so what I found over here is 1 and 10 solve my number riddle. So this middle term I can actually make plus 1x plus 10x. I can put that 1 and 10 in front of x. Notice how 1x plus 10x actually equals 11x. So it didn't change the value. What it did though is it created 4 terms so I can use grouping. Okay, but you have to have the number combination that multiplies to give you 10 and adds to give you 11. So now this is a problem exactly like what we did yesterday. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the greatest common factor of the first 2 terms, okay, which ends up in this case being x. I'm going to take that x out of each one of the first 2 terms. When I do that, you get 5x plus 1. What that means is when I find the greatest common factor of my second pair of terms, which are right here, in parentheses, I should get another 5x plus 1 if I'm doing it correctly. Okay, these 2 terms, 10x plus 2, they have a 2 that is their greatest common factor, a positive 2. So when I take a 2 out of both of them, notice how you are left with 5x plus 1 again. That should always happen. So at the end, just like yesterday, both of these have a 5x plus 1 in common. And when you factor that out of both, you're left with an x and a plus 2. An x plus 2. And so that one would factor out to 5x plus 1 and x plus 2. Okay, for our last problem today with trinomials, again, this is the one that takes a little bit more work because you have a number in front of x squared. What I want you to notice, though, which will make it a little bit easier, is that all 3 terms here actually have something you can take out first, which will make the problem a lot easier. So before I make my t-chart, I'm going to take a number out. All those have a 2 in common. So I'm going to go ahead and divide each by 2 and rewrite it. When I do that, I get 3x squared plus 4x minus 15. I am going to make my t-chart based on that, so the numbers are smaller. Okay, so just like I've been doing, I'm going to make my t-chart. And so if I use what I just wrote down and boxed in, a times c, a is 3, c is negative 15, so a times c is negative 45. B, the number in front of x in the middle, is 4. So I need two numbers that multiply to give me negative 45 and add to give you 4. Since I'm multiplying to get a negative number, I know one of them is going to be negative and the other positive. So I'll go and write that in. Okay, the combination that would work to multiply and give you negative 45 and to give you positive 4 would end up being some combination of 9 and 5. Okay, in this case, it's positive 9, negative 5. When you multiply those together, you get negative 45. When you add them, you get positive 4. So what that means, just like I did in the last problem, I'm going to leave the first term the same, the last term the same. The middle term I'm going to break up into negative 5x and positive 9x. Okay, and again, what that does, it gives me something that still equals 4x, but now I have 4 terms, so I can actually group them. My first two terms have an x in common, so I'm going to take an x out. When I take an x out, I'm left with 3x minus 5. My second terms that I have, okay, when I end up taking an x out, or I'm sorry, not an x, but in this case a 3. 3 is the greatest common factor. So I'm going to pull a 3 out. When I take a 3 out, notice how you're left with 3x minus 5. You get the same thing in parentheses. Again, that's how you know you're doing it correctly. So at the end, they have those in common. They have a 3x minus 5 in common. And if you take those out, you're left with an x plus 3. X plus 3. Okay, so I'm almost done. The last thing I got to remember is I originally pulled out a 2 right here. So I need to go ahead and put that 2 back in front of everything. So I originally took it out. So this would be my final factored